Sometimes the person who changes your life forever is already standing in front of you, and neither of you knows it yet. Rain tapped softly against the windows of Harbor Street Grill on a chilly evening in Boston. The restaurant was busy, but not loud. Families filled booths near the walls. Business travelers occupied small tables near the bar. The scent of coffee and grilled salmon drifted through the warm dining room, while soft jazz played overhead. Grace Walker moved carefully between tables, carrying a tray balanced effortlessly on one hand. At 27 years old, she had spent enough years working in restaurants to understand people quickly. Some customers were kind. Some were impatient. Most were forgettable. Grace treated them all the same. Her blonde hair was neatly tied back beneath the restaurant's dress code requirements. Her blue eyes remained calm even during the busiest shifts. She had learned long ago that professionalism made difficult people easier to survive. Near 7 o'clock, the front doors opened with unusual force. Several guests looked up. A tall man entered wearing an expensive dark coat and carrying the unmistakable energy of someone accustomed to getting his way. Jonathan Reed, one of the most successful businessmen in Massachusetts, owner of multiple companies, frequently featured in financial magazines, wealthy enough that most people recognized his face before hearing his name. Tonight, however, Jonathan looked less like a millionaire and more like a man who had experienced a very long day. His expression was tense. His phone remained pressed against his ear as he crossed the dining room. "No," he said sharply. "That meeting should have happened yesterday." He listened briefly before ending the call without another word. The hostess greeted him politely. Jonathan barely acknowledged her. He requested a table near the window and sat down immediately. Several servers exchanged glances. Everyone knew the type. Demanding, impatient, difficult. One waitress quietly volunteered to take another section instead. Another suddenly found reasons to stay busy elsewhere. Grace noticed the reaction. Then she picked up a menu and walked toward his table. "Good evening," she said warmly. "Can I start you with something to drink?" Jonathan looked up briefly. "Coffee." "Certainly." "Black." "Of course." Grace smiled politely and wrote down the order. Jonathan returned his attention to his phone before she finished speaking. 10 minutes later, she returned with fresh coffee. Jonathan took one sip and frowned. "This is barely hot." Grace glanced at the cup. Steam still rose from the surface. "I apologize. I can bring a fresh pot immediately." Jonathan pushed the cup aside. "Forget it." Several nearby customers looked uncomfortable. Grace remained composed. "Would you like a different beverage?" "What I would like is one simple thing done correctly." The words hung in the air. Sharp. Unnecessary. Yet Grace showed no sign of irritation. "I understand." Jonathan stared at her for a moment. Most people reacted when he spoke that way. They became defensive, nervous, annoyed. Grace simply stood there waiting calmly for his order. Finally, he sighed. "Just bring another coffee." "Right away." As Grace walked back toward the kitchen, Jonathan watched her longer than expected. Something about her felt oddly familiar. Not her voice, not her uniform, something else. Something he could not immediately place. Across the restaurant, Grace poured a fresh cup and continued serving other guests. She thought nothing of the encounter. Difficult customers appeared every week. They came and went. This one seemed no different. Yet neither of them realized that a single dinner service was about to awaken a story that had been waiting nearly 3 decades to be discovered. The restaurant remained busy long after the rain outside began falling harder. Headlights reflected across the wet streets while customers drifted in and out through the evening. Grace continued moving from table to table with the same quiet efficiency she brought to every shift. Yet something unusual had changed. Every time she approached Jonathan Reed's table, she caught him studying her for a second longer than before. Not in a rude way, not even in a curious way, more like someone trying to remember a song he had not heard in years. Jonathan found the feeling increasingly frustrating. He prided himself on having a sharp memory. Names, numbers, faces. He rarely forgot important details. Yet the waitress continued triggering a sense of familiarity he could not explain. When Grace returned with another cup of coffee, he looked up again. "How long have you worked here?" The question surprised her. Most difficult customers never asked personal questions. "About 4 years," she replied politely. Jonathan nodded. "You from Boston?" "Born here." Her answer was simple. "Professional." She started to leave. Then he spoke again. "Have we met before?" Grace smiled faintly. I do not think so. Jonathan almost agreed. Yet something in her blue eyes made him hesitate. They reminded him of someone. Someone from a very different chapter of his life. A chapter he had not thought about in decades. Before he could explore the thought further, his phone rang again. Another business call. Another problem demanding attention. The moment disappeared. Across the dining room, Grace helped a young family settle into a booth. A little girl accidentally dropped a crayon beneath the table. Grace retrieved it and returned it with a smile. The child grinned immediately. Nearby, an elderly couple thanked her for remembering their usual order. Moments like these filled her evenings. Small interactions. Ordinary kindnesses. Nothing dramatic. Yet they mattered. Jonathan noticed all of it. He watched customers greet her by name. He watched coworkers trust her. He watched strangers relax around her almost instantly. Respect seemed to follow her naturally. It was not something she demanded. It was something she earned. An hour later, after finally finishing dinner, Jonathan requested the check. Grace placed the receipt folder on the table. Take your time, she said. As she turned away, a silver necklace slipped briefly from beneath her uniform collar. Attached to it was a small locket. Jonathan barely saw it before it disappeared again. Yet something about it caught his attention. Not the jewelry itself. The sudden image it awakened. A memory. Faint. Incomplete. Long brown summer grass moving in the wind. A young woman laughing beneath a July sunset. A silver locket resting against her neck. Jonathan blinked. The memory vanished as quickly as it appeared. He stared at the receipt for several seconds. For the first time all evening, his expression softened. When Grace returned to collect the payment, she noticed the change immediately. Was everything satisfactory? She asked. Jonathan looked at her carefully. Yes. Then after a brief pause he added, Thank you. The words seemed unusual coming from him. Even he appeared surprised by them. Grace smiled politely. You are welcome. A few minutes later, Jonathan stepped out into the rain and disappeared into the city. Yet during the drive home, he found himself thinking less about business and more about a waitress he had met only once. Meanwhile, back inside the restaurant, Grace cleared his table and moved on with her evening, completely unaware that a forgotten piece of someone else's past had just begun waking up. For the next several days, Jonathan Reed told himself the waitress was no longer on his mind. He had board meetings to attend, contracts to review, investors expecting answers. His schedule remained packed from morning until evening. Yet every time a quiet moment appeared, his thoughts drifted back to Harbor Street Grill. More specifically, to the young woman with blue eyes and a silver locket. The feeling made little sense. Jonathan had met thousands of people throughout his career. He rarely remembered most of them. Yet somehow Grace Walker lingered in his memory like an unfinished sentence. On Friday evening, after another exhausting day, he found himself driving through the same neighborhood. The restaurant's glowing sign appeared ahead through the gathering twilight. Jonathan slowed. Then, almost without thinking, he pulled into the parking lot. Inside, the dining room looked much the same as before. Warm lights, soft music, familiar conversations. Grace was helping a family near the entrance when she noticed him walk through the door. For a brief moment, surprise crossed her face. Then professionalism returned immediately. Good evening, she said. Welcome back. Jonathan nodded. Good evening. This time his tone was noticeably calmer. The hostess led him to a table. Several servers exchanged curious looks. Difficult customers rarely returned twice in 1 week. Throughout dinner, Jonathan found himself paying more attention to Grace than to his meal. Not because he intended to, because every small detail seemed to strengthen the strange feeling of familiarity. The way she smiled when speaking to elderly customers. The way she listened carefully before answering questions. Even the way she tucked a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear. Somewhere in the back of his mind, old memories continued stirring. Later that evening, Grace placed the check on his table. Jonathan reached for a pen to sign the receipt. As he did, he glanced at the name printed near the top of her service tag. Grace Walker. The surname stopped him. Walker. The room around him seemed to grow quieter. He stared at the name for several seconds. A memory surfaced immediately. Margaret Walker. He had not spoken that name aloud in nearly 3 decades. Margaret, a young woman he had known during a summer before business success, before wealth, before the life he now lived. She had been intelligent, kind, determined. and she had worn a silver locket almost every day. Jonathan felt a sudden chill despite the warmth of the restaurant. It could not mean anything. Walker was not an uncommon name. Coincidences happened every day. Yet the combination unsettled him. The eyes, the locket, the name. Grace noticed his expression. "Is everything all right?" Jonathan looked up quickly. "Yes." The answer came too fast. Grace tilted her head slightly, but said nothing. After years in customer service, she had learned when people preferred to keep their thoughts private. Jonathan signed the receipt and stood to leave. Before reaching the door, he glanced back one final time. Grace was helping another table, completely unaware of the questions now racing through his mind. Outside, cold air greeted him as he stepped onto the sidewalk. He remained there for several moments, staring through the restaurant window. Then he returned to his car and drove home. Hours later, long after midnight, Jonathan sat alone in his study surrounded by shelves of books and business awards. Yet his attention rested on none of them. Instead, he found himself opening an old storage cabinet he had not touched in years. Somewhere inside waited pieces of a past he thought had been buried forever. And for the first time, he began wondering whether the young waitress serving coffee at a neighborhood restaurant might somehow be connected to a story he had never truly finished. The storage cabinet stood untouched in the corner of Jonathan Reed's study, like a forgotten doorway to another life. Dust covered several boxes stacked neatly along the bottom shelf. Business awards lined the walls around him. Financial success surrounded him from every direction. Yet none of it held his attention that night. Slowly, he opened the first box. Old photographs, newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, fragments of years he rarely allowed himself to revisit. Outside the tall windows of his home, rain continued falling across the city. Inside, memories began returning one piece at a time. Then he found it, a small bundle of letters secured with a faded ribbon. Jonathan stared at it for several moments before carefully loosening the knot. The handwriting on the first envelope stopped him immediately. Margaret Walker. Even after 27 years, he recognized it instantly. His chest tightened. He sat down and unfolded the letter with trembling fingers. The paper had yellowed with age, but the words remained clear. Margaret wrote about her life, her plans, her hopes. She wrote about waiting for a response that never came. Jonathan closed his eyes. During those years, his life had been changing rapidly. He had moved cities, changed jobs, chased opportunities. He remembered receiving letters occasionally, but many had never reached him after multiple relocations. At least that was what he had always assumed. Now uncertainty began replacing certainty. He continued reading. Then another envelope caught his attention. This one had never been opened. The seal remained intact. Jonathan stared at it for a long time before carefully breaking it. The date on the front stopped him cold. 27 years earlier. Around the exact time he had lost contact with Margaret. He unfolded the pages slowly. The room seemed to disappear around him. Margaret's words were simple, honest, emotional. She explained that she was pregnant. She explained that she had tried repeatedly to reach him. She explained that she did not know whether he would ever read the letter. Jonathan felt the air leave his lungs. His eyes moved across the page again. And again, the same sentence remained there every time. Pregnant. He lowered the paper. The silence inside the room became overwhelming. For several minutes, he simply sat there staring at nothing. Memories flooded back with painful clarity. Margaret's laughter. Summer evenings beside the harbor. Promises made by two young people who believed there would always be more time. Yet somehow life had carried them in different directions. Jonathan looked back at the letter. Another detail caught his attention. Margaret had mentioned a daughter. Not a possibility. Not a hope. A daughter. Jonathan stood and walked toward the window. Rain streaked across the glass while Boston's lights shimmered below. A daughter. The words echoed through his mind. Then another image appeared. Blonde hair. Blue eyes. A silver locket. Grace Walker. The coincidence suddenly felt far too large to ignore. Yet fear arrived just as quickly. What if he was wrong? What if years of regret were simply making him see connections where none existed? He returned to the desk and continued reading every letter inside the box. Hour after hour passed. By the time dawn approached, one truth had become impossible to escape. The past he believed was finished had never truly ended. Somewhere in the city, a young waitress, was beginning another ordinary day, completely unaware that a forgotten letter had just changed everything for a man she barely knew. And for the first time, Jonathan found himself afraid of discovering whether his growing suspicion was true. The days that followed felt different for Jonathan Reed. Not because anything around him had changed. His companies continued operating. Meetings continued filling his calendar. Business opportunities continued arriving. Yet beneath the familiar routine, a single question followed him everywhere. Could Grace Walker really be his daughter? The possibility seemed impossible. It also seemed impossible to ignore. 3 evenings later, Jonathan returned to Harbor Street Grill once again. This time he arrived earlier than usual. The restaurant was quieter. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the windows, painting soft patterns across the wooden floors. Grace was arranging silverware near the hostess stand when she noticed him entering. For a moment, genuine surprise crossed her face. 3 visits in less than 2 weeks was unusual, especially from someone like him. "Good evening," she said with a friendly smile. "Good evening." Jonathan's voice sounded calmer now, less guarded. The sharp edges from their first meeting had softened. Grace guided him to a table near the window. As she handed him a menu, Jonathan noticed the silver locket again, resting lightly against her collarbone. The sight immediately tightened something inside his chest. During dinner, he found himself asking small questions whenever the opportunity appeared. Nothing intrusive, nothing inappropriate, just enough to understand her better. "Have you always lived in Boston?" he asked while she refilled his coffee. "Most of my life," Grace replied. "Did your family live here too?" The question slipped out before he could stop himself. Grace hesitated briefly, not because she seemed offended, because the answer required thought. "My mother did." Jonathan felt his pulse quicken. He kept his expression neutral. "And your father?" Grace offered a small smile, the kind people use when discussing something they accepted long ago. "I never knew him." Jonathan looked down at his coffee. For a moment, the noise of the restaurant faded into the background. Grace continued speaking casually. "It was always just my mother and me." She said it without bitterness, without resentment, simply as a fact. Yet every word seemed to land heavily inside him. Later, while serving another table, Grace laughed at something an elderly customer said. Jonathan watched from across the room. He remembered Margaret's laugh. Bright, warm, effortless. The resemblance suddenly felt impossible to dismiss. As the evening continued, another coincidence appeared. A regular customer approached Grace carrying an old framed photograph he wanted restored. The picture had fallen from its frame. Grace accepted it carefully and smiled. "This looks important." The man nodded. "It belonged to my wife." Grace examined the photograph briefly before returning it. Jonathan could not see the image clearly, but he noticed something else. As Grace held the picture, her locket slipped open slightly. Inside was a tiny photograph, only visible for a second. Yet Jonathan caught enough to freeze his thoughts completely. A young woman with familiar features smiled from inside the worn silver frame. Margaret. The image disappeared as Grace gently closed the locket and tucked it beneath her uniform again. She never noticed Jonathan staring. His heart pounded harder than it had during any business negotiation in years. The clues no longer felt separate. The surname, the eyes, the locket, the letters, the photograph. Piece after piece was sliding into place. Yet despite everything, fear remained. Because if the truth was really waiting at the end of this path, it meant something far greater than discovering a secret. It meant realizing that 27 years of someone else's life had passed without him being part of it. And for the first time since finding Margaret's letters, Jonathan began wondering whether the answer he desperately wanted was also the answer he feared most. After that evening, Jonathan Reed stopped trying to convince himself the similarities were coincidences. There were simply too many of them now. The letters, the surname, the photograph inside the locket, the timeline. Every piece pointed toward the same possibility. Yet certainty remained just out of reach. And strangely, that uncertainty became its own burden. For several days, Jonathan carried it everywhere. During meetings, he found himself distracted. During conversations, his attention drifted. Numbers and contracts that once demanded complete focus suddenly felt less important than a question waiting in a small restaurant across the city. Meanwhile, Grace continued living exactly as she always had. She worked long shifts, paid bills, visited the small apartment where her mother had raised her. To her, Life remained completely ordinary. She had no idea that someone else was quietly rebuilding the story of her childhood from scattered fragments of the past. One Saturday afternoon, Jonathan drove to a neighborhood he had not visited in decades. The streets looked different now. New buildings stood where older ones had once been. Small businesses had changed names. Time had left its mark everywhere. Yet after speaking with several longtime residents and searching through public records, he eventually found what he was looking for. A modest church cemetery near the edge of the city. The air was cool. A light breeze moved through the trees. Jonathan walked slowly between rows of headstones until he saw a familiar name. Margaret Walker. For a long moment, he simply stood there. No words came. No dramatic realization. Just silence. 27 years had passed since he last saw her. 27 years since life had carried them apart. Flowers rested near the grave. Fresh ones. Someone still visited regularly. Jonathan already knew who that person probably was. Later that evening, he returned home and opened the letters again. This time he noticed details he had missed before. Margaret never expressed anger, never demanded anything, never blamed him. Instead, she wrote about hope, about wanting her daughter to grow up surrounded by kindness, about believing that people should be judged by how they treat others, not by what they own. Jonathan closed his eyes. The words sounded familiar because he had already seen them reflected in Grace. Suddenly, he understood why she seemed different from so many people he met. She carried her mother's values. The realization filled him with both comfort and regret. Days later, Jonathan returned to Harbor Street Grill once again. Grace greeted him with the same warm professionalism she offered every customer. Nothing about her behavior changed. Nothing suggested she suspected anything unusual. Jonathan found himself studying her less as a mystery and more as a person. He noticed how she helped new employees learn procedures without making them feel embarrassed. He noticed how she remembered customers' birthdays. He noticed how she listened when people spoke. Small things, ordinary things, yet they mattered, more than he expected. For the first time, Jonathan realized he was no longer visiting the restaurant to investigate. He was visiting because he wanted to know her. Not as evidence, not as a possibility, as a human being. That realization frightened him even more than the mystery itself. Because if the truth eventually proved what he suspected, he would have to face a painful reality. He had not merely missed a fact. He had missed an entire life. Every birthday, every school event, every achievement, every difficult moment. 27 years that could never be recovered. As Grace brought another cup of coffee to his table, she smiled politely. "You seem quieter lately." Jonathan looked at her for a moment before answering. "Maybe I have been thinking about things I should have thought about a long time ago." Grace nodded thoughtfully, unaware of how true the statement really was. And as she walked away, Jonathan finally understood something important. He was no longer afraid of discovering the truth. He was afraid the truth would confirm exactly what his heart already knew. The following week arrived with a strange sense of anticipation neither of them fully understood. Grace noticed it first. Jonathan Reed had become a regular customer. Not the demanding businessman who had walked through the door on that rainy evening weeks earlier, but someone quieter, more thoughtful. He still arrived alone, still ordered coffee, still preferred the table near the window. Yet something about him had changed. The impatience was gone. The sharp comments had disappeared. In their place was a man who seemed to be searching for something he could not quite name. Grace found herself wondering about him occasionally. Not because he was wealthy. Most people in Boston knew who Jonathan Reed was. But because beneath the expensive suits and business headlines, he seemed unexpectedly lonely. One evening, as she refilled his coffee, Jonathan glanced toward the silver locket resting against her uniform. "That necklace seems important to you." Grace smiled softly and touched it instinctively. "It is." Jonathan waited. She rarely volunteered personal information, but tonight her expression softened. "It belonged to my mother." The answer settled heavily between them. Jonathan nodded slowly. "You were close." Grace looked down at the locket. "Very close." For a moment, the restaurant around them seemed quieter. "She passed away 5 years ago," Grace continued. "But I still carry this every day." Jonathan felt his chest tighten. "I am sorry." Grace smiled gently. "Thank you." Then she opened the small locket for the first time in front of him. Inside sat the tiny photograph he had glimpsed before. Margaret, younger, smiling. Unmistakably Margaret. Jonathan stared at the image. The room blurred around him. Every remaining doubt disappeared in an instant. It was her. The same eyes. The same smile. The same woman from the letters. Grace noticed the emotion crossing his face. Did you know her? Jonathan looked up immediately. Fear and hope collided inside him. This was the moment he had imagined for days. Yet now that it stood before him, he felt completely unprepared. He stopped. The truth sat only inches away. One sentence could change both their lives forever. But another thought stopped him. Grace deserved more than a rushed confession in the middle of a dinner shift. More than an emotional revelation beside a coffee cup. She deserved certainty. She deserved respect. Most of all, she deserved the full truth. Jonathan forced himself to remain calm. She reminds me of someone I knew a long time ago. Grace smiled. People used to say that my mother left an impression on everyone she met. Jonathan believed it. More than she could possibly know. Later that night, after the restaurant closed, Jonathan sat alone in his car outside. The city lights reflected across the windshield while the photograph from the locket replayed endlessly in his mind. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. It was real, painfully real. He finally understood why Grace had seemed familiar from the beginning, why her voice felt comforting, why her smile carried echoes of another lifetime. The answer had been standing in front of him all along. Meanwhile, inside her small apartment, Grace opened the locket once more before bed. She smiled at her mother's photograph as she always did. Then she placed it gently against her heart, completely unaware that somewhere across the city, a man was staring at an old bundle of letters and silently whispering the words he never thought he would have the chance to say. My daughter. The next morning, Jonathan Reed made a decision he had postponed for far too long. He gathered the letters, the photographs, every piece of information he had spent weeks uncovering. Then he placed them carefully into a leather folder and sat staring at it across his desk. Outside, autumn sunlight filled the city. Inside, uncertainty filled the room. For most of his life, Jonathan had built a reputation for making difficult decisions quickly. Yet none of those decisions had ever felt as important as this one. Because this was not about business. It was about a human life. A life that had continued without him for 27 years. Across the city, Grace Walker began another ordinary day. She stopped at her favorite coffee shop before work. She greeted neighbors she had known for years. She visited the small apartment where her mother's belongings remained carefully preserved. Whenever life felt complicated, Grace often found comfort there. That afternoon, she opened an old wooden box containing family photographs. Most showed birthdays, school events, and holidays. Nearly every picture included Margaret. Grace smiled as she flipped through them. Then she paused at one photograph she had seen hundreds of times before. It showed her mother standing near Boston Harbor when she was young. Beside Margaret stood a man whose face had always remained a mystery. The image captured only part of him. A shoulder, a profile, the edge of a smile. Her mother had never explained much about the photograph. Whenever Grace asked questions about her father, Margaret simply answered that life had taken unexpected turns and that some stories were complicated. As a child, Grace accepted the explanation. As an adult, she stopped asking. Later that evening, Harbor Street Grill filled with its usual crowd. Grace worked steadily through the dinner rush until she noticed a familiar figure entering through the front doors. Jonathan. Something felt different immediately. Not because of his appearance. Because of the expression on his face. He looked nervous. More nervous than she had ever seen him. Grace guided him to his usual table. Everything all right? She asked gently. Jonathan smiled faintly. I hope so. The answer puzzled her. Throughout the meal, he barely touched his food. Several times he appeared ready to speak before changing his mind. Finally, after the restaurant had grown quieter, Jonathan reached into his briefcase and placed the leather folder on the table. His hands trembled slightly. Grace noticed. Mr. Reed. Jonathan looked at her. For a moment, words seemed impossible. Then he took a slow breath. There is something I think you should see. Grace sat across from him during a short break approved by her manager. Jonathan opened the folder carefully. The first item he revealed was an old photograph. Grace's eyes widened immediately. That is my mother. Jonathan nodded. I know. Next came a letter. Then another. Then another. Each bearing Margaret Walker's handwriting. Grace stared at the pages in disbelief. Where did you get these? Jonathan swallowed hard. The question he had rehearsed countless times suddenly felt inadequate. Because they were sent to me. Silence settled over the table. The sounds of the restaurant faded into the distance. Grace looked from the letters to Jonathan and back again. Slowly, almost reluctantly, understanding began forming behind her eyes. Jonathan could see it happening. The realization neither of them had been prepared to face. 27 years of separation. 27 years of unanswered questions. 27 years of a truth hidden inside forgotten letters. And as Grace looked at the final photograph resting between them, the world she thought she understood began changing forever. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The letters rested on the table between them like a bridge built from lost years. Around them, Harbor Street Grill continued its evening routine. Dishes clinked softly. Conversations drifted through the dining room. The world kept moving. Yet for Grace Walker and Jonathan Reed, time seemed to pause. Grace carefully picked up one of the letters and read it again. Then another. Each page carried her mother's voice. Familiar, honest, real. Tears gathered in her eyes, not from sadness alone, but from the overwhelming realization that a part of her life she believed would remain unanswered forever was suddenly sitting across from her. Jonathan remained silent. He knew there was no speech capable of repairing 27 years. No explanation large enough to erase the absence. Finally, Grace looked up. You never knew? Jonathan shook his head immediately. If I had known, I would have found you. His voice carried a sincerity that was impossible to fake. I never received these letters until recently. I found them stored away among old belongings. By the time I read them, decades had already passed. Grace studied him carefully. For the first time, she was not looking at a customer, not looking at a millionaire. She was looking at the man who might have spent years wondering about a future that never happened. My mother never spoke badly about you, she said quietly. Jonathan lowered his eyes. That truth hurt more than blame would have. She was a better person than I deserved. Grace smiled through her tears. She usually was. Both laughed softly. The tension eased. Not completely, but enough. Over the following weeks, something unexpected happened. Neither of them rushed. There were no dramatic announcements. No headlines. No sudden transformation. Instead, they did something much harder. They got to know each other. Jonathan learned about Grace's childhood, her favorite books, her habit of drinking coffee while watching sunrise from her apartment window. Grace learned about the mistakes he regretted, the lessons success never taught him, and the loneliness hidden behind a life that appeared perfect from the outside. Some conversations were joyful. Others were uncomfortable. Yet each one mattered. One Saturday afternoon, Jonathan visited the cemetery where Margaret rested. Grace stood beside him beneath a clear autumn sky. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then Grace placed fresh flowers near the headstone. Jonathan looked at the engraved name and felt tears he had carried for decades finally escape. Grace gently placed a hand on his shoulder. No words were necessary. The moment said everything. Months later, life looked surprisingly ordinary. Grace still worked at Harbor Street Grill because she genuinely enjoyed it. Jonathan still ran his companies. Neither tried to become someone different. Yet something important had changed. They no longer faced life alone. One evening, after finishing her shift, Grace joined Jonathan for coffee near the harbor. The same harbor where Margaret had once walked years earlier. The city lights reflected across the water while a cool breeze moved through the air. Jonathan smiled. I still wish I had known sooner. Grace looked toward the horizon. So do I. Then she smiled back at him. But at least now we know. Jonathan nodded. Sometimes life gives people exactly what they expect. Other times it gives them something far more meaningful. Not a perfect ending. Not lost years returned. Simply a second chance. And as father and daughter sat together watching the harbor lights shimmer across the dark water, one quiet truth remained. Sometimes the people we spend a lifetime searching for have been standing right in front of us all along.